Morning, LifePoint Church. If we haven't met, my name is Brady, and I'm an imperfect follower of Jesus. And that's what we are, a community of people who are imperfect, just stumbling our way towards Jesus the best that we can. As we're singing the second song, Make Me More Like Jesus, I love that song. It's a great song. And, you know, there are things when I read about Jesus, when I see his kindness, or when I see him teaching the Sermon on the Mount, and he's brilliant, and he's compelling, and he's captivating, or when somebody asks him a question, he's trying to trick him, and he sees through it, and he just speaks right into the heart of that person. I think, yes, make me more like Jesus. I want to be more like that. I want to be more wise. I want to be more compelling, more captivating. I want to be, we see Jesus healing people. Like, I want to be more powerful. Like, yes, I'm into that. But there are times, and the passage, the story we're going to look at today is one of those times where you read it and you think, do I really want to be more like Jesus? So that's what it's going to be like this morning. Just want to prepare you, welcome to LifePoint Church if you're new. It's going to be rough. We're in the book of John, which is a book in the New Testament, which is part of a much bigger story. And so we've been looking at what is the story of the Bible and how do all of the parts fit into the whole. And so we've got this image. There's these 4 different images that can help you hopefully remember what the story of the Bible is. Because I hope that we would all know, that we would all understand what the story of the Bible is. And so the very first one, there's a who, there's a what, and there's a why. The story of the Bible is about, who's the main character in the story of the Bible? God. It's a story about God, and he's doing something. What is he doing? Creating heaven and earth for what purpose? Why is he doing this? To be unified under the rule of God and humans together. Okay, so if you look at the very beginning of the Bible and you look at the trajectory moving forward, that's what the story of the Bible is. And what you'll find is as you read through the scriptures, that's what it's about. It's about God creating heaven and earth to be united under the rule of God and humans together. And then you move to pain number 2. And there's actually a lot of pain in pain number 2. But in the second image, at the 2 trees, humans say, we don't want that. We don't want to rule with you, God. We don't want you to define good and evil. We want to define good and evil. We don't want you telling us what is right and what is wrong. We want to be able to choose for ourselves what is best for us, right? You don't know my life. I want to be able to choose what is good for me in any given moment. And so you see humanity rejecting God and God politely saying, okay. And you see this separation of heaven and earth and how they become these 2 separate spaces. And humanity, instead of ruling with God, they reject God. And you see in this third image, or in the second image, they lose their crowns, right? We're no longer ruling. We have subjected ourselves under the prince of the power of this air, or Satan, or the devil. Scripture talks about the enemy in a number of different ways. And so the story, if the story of the Bible is about God creating heaven and earth to be unified under the rule of God and humans together, and humans say no, then from that point on, there has to be someone who will correct what we have messed up. And it's the story of the Messiah, or the anointed king. And he's the one who at the 2 trees is going to pass the test. He's going to submit himself to God. He's going to conquer sin and death, and he will reunite heaven and earth under the rule of God and humans together. In fact, he is the God and human together, right? Who rules and reigns over all. And when we get to the Gospels, we find out this is Jesus. And John says it very clearly in his theme of his book, his mission statement for why he's writing. In John chapter 20, verse 30, he says this, now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but I've selected these specific ones. He said, but these are written. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, yes. And he's also the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. John is saying that Jesus is the one who's going to come, pass the test, conquer sin and death, reunite heaven and earth. He is the Messiah, but he's also the Son of God. That Jesus came to reveal what God is like, to answer the biggest question that all of us are asking is, if there's a God, what's he like? What is his disposition towards us? How does he treat rebellious, sinful humanity? What is God like? And Jesus reveals who God is, and that through believing in Jesus, we can have life in his name. Now, a life very differently than probably we imagine it in our culture. When we think of life abundantly, as Jesus talks about, perhaps we think about money, perhaps we think about fame or security or popularity or power. We think about these things that we believe will give us life, right? Will give us joy, will give us happiness. And the way of Jesus is very different than that. Believing in Jesus, following in Jesus' footsteps is very different because it's an upside-down kingdom. But Jesus says that that way is the way that is actually life. And we see this play out in the book of John. Now I'm going to show you another image. We haven't looked at this one in a while, but last week as we looked at the story of Lazarus, that was like the turning point in the book of John. And so I just kind of want to review where we're at in the book of John. As you study the Bible or as you study the book of John, you can put your own words in that will help you remember what was going on in each section. But these are the words that I've put together. So at the very beginning, we have the introduction, and it's an unfinished introduction. It ends with a sentence that is unfinished. And John is bringing our minds back to Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the world, and then on the seventh day, God rests, but it's unfinished. It doesn't end up happening like that. And John is letting us know that Jesus is the finisher. In fact, those are the last words out of Jesus' mouth before he dies. It is finished. He has accomplished the work that needed to happen so that there can be one day this ultimate seventh-day rest. And then we looked at the second story in chapter 2, that Jesus turned water into wine. And the guy said, oh, wait, you saved the good wine until now. And we were like, no, that's Jesus. Jesus is the good wine that has been saved until now. And then we looked in the second half of chapter 2 that Jesus cleansed the temple. And he symbolized that he is, in fact, the temple. He is where heaven and earth meet. And that's what the temple was. That's what the tabernacle was. It was where heaven and earth meet. And we saw in chapter 1 how that is exactly who Jesus is. God dwelt or tabernacled among us. Then we looked at chapter 3, and he had this conversation with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus was really confused about what the day was going to be like when God came. He thought it was going to be a day of harsh judgment. And what we find is that when God comes to earth, rather than it being a day of harsh judgment, Jesus came, and it was a day of extravagant grace. For God so loved the world that Jesus came. Jesus said, I didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. Right? It's a day of love. And then we looked at Jesus having a conversation with a woman at the well. And he said, I'm the living water. I'm going to give you living water. We went on and we found out that Jesus is in fact God. Jesus heals a paralyzed man, and then he says very clearly in a number of Jewish ways that he is God. And then we see later on that belief is movement toward Jesus. That belief is a present active participle. Belief is an ing word, right? It's looking toward Jesus. It's moving toward Jesus. Belief is believing in Jesus. Are you believing in Jesus? And then we saw how Jesus is full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. When they brought the woman caught in adultery to him, he first protected the sinful woman, the woman who was in sin. He protected her from the people who wanted to hurt her. And then he said, I don't condemn you. But he didn't stop there. He said, go and sin no more. Because a life that's lived saturated in sin is not life at all. It's living enslaved to our passions and our desires. It's living enslaved to sin. Jesus is full of grace, but he's also full of truth. And then we saw how Jesus, in comparison, or really in contrast to the leaders of his day, that he is the good shepherd who not only cares for the sheep, but actually lays down his life for his sheep. That's what Jesus is like. And then we see it playing out when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. He said, we're going to go see Lazarus. And the disciples are like, whoa, the Jewish people were trying to stone you. The leaders of the Jewish people, they were trying to stone you. Are you really going to go do that? Is it worth it for you to give your life for Lazarus? And Jesus says, yeah. Right? Greater love is no one than this, and that person laid down his life for his friends. And we see later on that Jesus does actually give up his life. he gets crucified. And a lot of it centers around what happens in the hearts and minds of the Jewish leaders when Lazarus is raised from the grave. They say, hey, now everybody's going to follow him, and the Romans are going to come take our position. And so they said, we've got to put him to death. And today, you would think, what's going to happen next? I mean, you look at all the stuff that has just happened, right? Jesus turned water to wine. He cleansed the temple. He healed a paralyzed man. He healed a man that was blind from birth. He raised Lazarus from the dead. You're thinking, like, how are you going to top that? What's next? Because John is writing this so that we can believe that he's the Messiah. And he's also writing so that we can see what is God like. So you think, what's going to happen next? Well, then Jesus comes into Jerusalem in triumph on this donkey, and everybody's praising his name. Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And you're thinking, what are you going to do next? He gets anointed, and it's just amazing. And we come to John chapter 13, verse 1. John chapter 13, verse 1 says this, now, before the feast of the Passover, so John is bringing our minds back to Egypt. When God brought his people out of Egypt, they were enslaved in Egypt. He brought them out into the promised land and formed his people. And this is what they were celebrating. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that an hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. Now that is a sentence. There's a lot going on there. And if you're anything like me, it's confusing. What else is going on? I put together an image of kind of how I would study this passage to kind of bring some clarity because there are a lot of thoughts. And I'm trying to imagine John writing this. And so Jesus is about to perform a very important action. But as John is about to write it, he says, okay, there are a number of things you've got to understand before you can really fully know what's going on in the action that Jesus performs. You have to know what all is going on in Jesus' mind. You need to understand it. So here's how I studied it. First, I put squares around words of time. So you've got before, you have during, you've got when. So at first, John says before the Feast of the Passover, and then he says during supper. So you kind of got to have that in your mind. And then he writes three major things that Jesus knows. Three major things that Jesus knows. Three major things that would have been on his heart and his mind as he went and did this action when he rose from supper. And so you've got in the green, one thing that Jesus knew was his hour had come to depart out of this world. Another thing Jesus knew is the devil had already put it into Judas' heart to betray him. And the last thing he knew is that the Father had given all things into his hands. So I went ahead on a different image. I put it together in a way that might make more sense to our minds and the way that we think. Right? You've got Jesus loving his disciples, right? I put it in parentheses. He said Jesus loved his disciples, he loved them to the end. So this thing that Jesus is about to do is a part of Jesus loving his disciples to the end, right? It's him demonstrating in a very unique way, in a very powerful way, his love, maybe not the way that we might think about it, but in the way that Jesus thought about it, his love for his disciples. So Jesus is loving his disciples. He rises from supper to do something. But he had three things on his mind. First thing, it was time for him to depart to the Father. Now, we think about this type of thing by saying, what's on your bucket list, right? When you think about, okay, I've got a little bit of time left, what am I going to do with that time, right? What if you could do anything before you die, what would you do? If you could have any conversation before you die, who would you have that conversation with? Right, we talk about these things in that way. One of my favorite clips in a movie comes from Walk the Line. It's about Johnny Cash, and he's in this studio, and he's trying to get a record deal. He's trying to record his first song, and there's a record producer with him, and he and his band are playing this song. And in the middle of the song, the record producer just says, stop playing. And Johnny's like, wait, what? Was it bad? And he's like, no, it was fine. He said, but it's the same thing I've heard on the radio every time I turn it on, right? It's just like everybody else. What makes you different? And Johnny's kind of frustrated. He doesn't really know what to do. And the producer says this. He said, here's the deal. Johnny, if you were lying in a ditch, dying, and you had 5 minutes left to live, you had enough time to play one song, what song would you play? You only have one chance to give your message out to the world, what's on your heart, what's on your mind. What would you say? What would you do? So think about it like this. Jesus knows, hey, it's time to go. I've got a short amount of time with my disciples before I die. What am I going to tell them? What am I going to do? What am I going to demonstrate? It's a very important segment of time, right? And this is on his mind. Secondly, the devil had already prompted Judas to betray him. Now, I don't know about you, but I love a good revenge story. I do, right? When I'm watching a movie and the first, 10 minutes is about some guy or some girl just someone is just the worst to them, and the rest of the movie is about them taking revenge, I get into that. I mean, maybe I'm the worst. I am the worst. But, I'm all about them getting their revenge. And so this is on Jesus' mind. This guy is about to betray Jesus so that he will then get spit on, mocked, beaten, and tortured to death. And Jesus knows this. And he knows this guy who's with him at the table has already decided to do this. We see it play out. He makes it more clear later on. But this is on Jesus' mind. What's Jesus going to do to him? And then lastly, the Father had given all things into his hands. Jesus had all authority and all power. Now, when you look at Jesus' life, it's hard to know what Jesus knows and what he doesn't know. Because Jesus is fully God, and God knows everything, right? But he's also fully human, and he chose, as Philippians says in other places, that he chose to lay aside his divine privileges and live a fully human life. And so you see in places like Luke 2:52 that Jesus grew in wisdom. So there were things that Jesus didn't know that he had to learn. There are times when Jesus said, I don't know the answer to that, only the Father knows that. There were things where Jesus limited his knowledge. And so we don't know what all Jesus was aware of. But what we find here at this moment, John makes it clear that at this moment, Jesus was aware that the Father had already given all things into his hands. He had all authority and all power. Now, you think about that. What are you going to do? I think about when someone wins the Super Bowl. They say, you just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do next? I'm going to Disney World, right? Now that you've just, you've won the election, what are you going to do? People ask that question. Now that you have authority, now that you have power, what are you going to do next? So this is a very important segment of time. What Jesus does next should be highlighted, should be starred, should be put in bold and italics. That's what John is trying to do. This is important. Pay attention. Jesus does something significant right now. He has three things on his mind. He's got all the power. He's about to leave, and there's someone among him who's going to betray him. And what does Jesus do with that information? Verse 4, he laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was around him. All authority, all power. He's about to die. What's he going to do? He bends down and washes the disciples' feet. Now, for some of you in here, you are super grossed out because feet are just gross to you, right? There are a number, you know who you are. Right? Your family knows that you have a thing, right? Feet are they're just kind of gross. And they're not just kind of gross, but think about this. There are many people who think feet are gross in our day and age. And in our day and age, we wear shoes, we have nice socks, and most places we walk are clean anyway. and yet we're grossed out by what could be on feet, okay? Now, let's rewind just a little bit. Let's rewind to Jesus' culture. One, it was a hot, dry, arid climate. They all would have been wearing sandals. And it would have been very dusty. And so they would walk through these dusty streets. So there would have been a lot of dirt and a lot of grime on their feet. But sanitation back then wasn't what it is today. I don't know if you know, this is a unique fact about Disneyland and Disney World. If you go to Frontierland, you'll notice that throughout the entire park, what you walk on is concrete. But in Frontierland, there's a little middle part that's made out of like a rock concrete, composition, and it just goes down the middle of where you walk. And you think, why is that? Well, because in the Wild Wild West, sanitation would flow down the middle of the street. And so they were helping you see that that's the way it was. Now, that was the Wild Wild West. Even further back, you have to understand, things weren't very sanitary back then. They didn't have Purell, right? No one knew that you had to wash your hands for 20 seconds, right? This is all brand new information. Right? They didn't have antibacterial soap. And when you would walk down the street, you would be walking through animal feces, right? Just this morning, stepped in my dog's poop. And I started to clean it off my shoe and almost gagged, It's just the way it was. And that was what they walked through on a daily basis, right? So on their feet is dirt and grime, animal feces, all kind of gross, nasty particles stuck to their feet. Not only that, not only was it physically gross what Jesus did, but it was also socially inappropriate. So the way that they lived in that day and age, it was like a caste system. So you had people that were a higher class and people that were lower class. And the classes didn't mix. And what the higher class was supposed to do, they did. And what lower class people were supposed to do, they did. And you did not cross that. You did not do things that were socially inappropriate in that way. Now, it's kind of hard for us to relate. The only way that I can even closely relate is think about junior high. Right, you've got the popular people and the unpopular people. You've got the athletes and the people who are not athletes. At least when I grew up, that's the way that it was. And as soon as you walk in the lunchroom, you know very clearly, okay, there's a caste system, and there are places that I can sit and places that I can't sit. Multiply that by about 1,000, and you begin to understand what it was like there. Now, in every society or every culture in that age, it was considered very lowly to wash feet. Whether you were Greek or Roman or just someone in the ancient Near East, it was something that only slaves were forced to do. And as I was reading, a lot of times they said only female slaves were forced to do that because in their minds, women were even lower. So whatever class you were, if you were a woman, you were lower. That's the way it was then. It's not good, it's not beautiful, but it was that way then. Now, if you're a Jewish person, there was another level to it. Jewish people never forced a Jewish servant or a Jewish slave to wash other people's feet. Only someone who was foreign to them, only what they would have called a Gentile. Only a servant who was a Gentile would be forced to wash other people's feet. That's how low it was considered to wash other people's feet. That task was the lowest task you could possibly be assigned to do. Now, sometimes, out of love, someone may wash someone's feet. A wife may wash her husband's feet, or a disciple may wash their rabbi's feet. That was pretty rare, but it happened. So now Jesus, who is the teacher, who in that room has the most authority, other than the fact that he's God, right? And he's also God, he bends down and washes his disciples' feet. Now think about that for a second. How would you feel if the most important person in your mind, person you think is just totally out of your league, just so far above you, so much more important than you, came and began to wash your feet? How would that make you feel? I mean, in our culture, maybe awkward, maybe embarrassed, maybe you're embarrassed about your feet, Or maybe it heaps on a lot of shame because you realize, oh, I probably should have done this. I probably should have washed everyone's feet when we came in. That's something that people were supposed to do. And what you find is that the disciples, none of them did that. Obviously, none of them washed anyone else's feet. None of them even washed Jesus' feet. Now, Jesus is washing your feet, and perhaps you're thinking, oh, I should have done that. I can't believe he's doing that. Why would he do that? And you see this as Peter reacts. In verse 6, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I'm doing, you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. And Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. You can see that. Peter's embarrassed. Maybe there's shame. Maybe his pride was exposed. But Jesus, who he holds in such high esteem, Jesus, who he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus, you are above me. And now Jesus is putting himself, placing himself physically below him and washing his feet, exposing his embarrassment. And he's like, no, you're never going to do that. And Jesus said to him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. And so Simon Peter does what Simon Peter does. Like he just goes all in, right? Just all in. He says, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Like, I'm all in, Jesus. If washing is how I get to be with you, it's how I get a share in you and your life and your family, then do it all, right? Get my whole body, Jesus. And Jesus says, slow down. The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean. And then if it wasn't awkward enough, he says this, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, not all of you are clean. And think about this. It's one thing for Jesus to like wash John's feet, the disciple that he loved, James's feet, or even Peter's feet. But man, Judas is at the table too. And what does Jesus know about Judas? He's already decided to betray him. It's already going to happen. And yet Jesus also washes Judas's feet. You know, I began to wonder this week, Jesus, would you have washed my feet? Because you don't know all that I know about me. But I just think, would you wash mine? And then I see Judas. And I'm so thankful that Jesus was willing to subject himself to such humility so that we might all know that none of us would be excluded from that. Even the one who would betray him, the one who would deny him, Peter, the one who would scatter when he needed him the most, all of his disciples, but even Judas who sold him for 30 pieces of silver to be tortured and to be killed. Jesus washed Judas's feet. And then he says this, and here's where it gets really difficult. You know, I love teaching passages of Scripture where there's, a Greek word or a Hebrew word that you got to bring out, really brings the force of it. Or, you got to kind of rearrange things to help you understand because the way it was written is a little bit complicated or confusing. I love to do that detective work. Here's the thing. This passage is not confusing at all. It's just hard to apply. That's what's rough about this passage. Because then Jesus does this. It says, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. It's like, you respect me. You look up to me. You call me this title of teacher. You call me the title of Lord. You're right to do that. You should do that. I am your teacher. I am your Lord. I'm the Son of God, okay? It's right to call me that. I didn't do this because I was the lowest. I didn't do it because I deserved it. I didn't do it because I was expected to or because I had to. He said, you call me teacher and Lord, you're right, because I am. And he said, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Now, I'll tell you what, if you look at the parallel passages in Matthew and Luke and Mark, you'll see that during this supper, which, by the way, that's dinner. I don't know if you guys have been hung up on this word supper. I was hung up on it a little bit. Supper's the big meal, right? It could be at dinner, it could be at lunchtime. At least that's what I'm told. My grandmother told me that. Supper's the big meal. It can move time. So during this dinner, during this supper, the disciples have an argument. Does anyone remember what that argument's about? Who's the greatest? Now, John doesn't lay out the timeline, but I think what makes the most sense is that they're having this argument amongst each other saying, who's the most important here? Who's the lowest here? They're trying to figure out the pecking order, right? They're trying to figure out the caste system. Who is the most important? Who's the most powerful? Who's the person who Jesus loves the most, right? They're trying to figure it out. And they're weighing it out. Like, oh, Peter, he says a bunch of great things, but he does a bunch of crazy things. Like John is the one whom Jesus loves, in some way, shape, or form, uniquely. Or maybe it's Thaddeus or Thomas as this really intellectual mind. Like, where do we fit? And it seems most likely that in that moment, as they're arguing about who the greatest is, Jesus gets up and does the task of the lowest person in there, demonstrating for them with his actions that the kingdom of heaven is very different. That it doesn't matter what level you are, the way that it works in the family of God is that we serve one another. We get down, we place ourselves below them, and as Paul said, do not look out for your own personal interests, but also look out for the interests of others. Don't consider yourself as more important than anyone else, but consider their needs as more important than yours. That's the way the family of God works. It's not that it's hard to understand what Jesus did and what he commands us to do. It's that it's really difficult to apply it. First, I want you to imagine you're in that room. And Jesus gets to you and he's going to wash your feet. In our culture, it's a little different, but what is that for you? What's that thing that you're embarrassed about? That Jesus says, let me see it. Let me hold it. Let me touch it. That thing that you're ashamed of. That thing that you hold real close that nobody knows about. That sin that you're involved in. That person that you've hurt. What is that thing that Jesus says, I want you to hold it out and let me touch it and let me cleanse it. Let me wash it clean. What would that be like? What's that thing that Jesus wants to cleanse you of that you're scared to give him? Realizing that he would seat you at that table and he would wash your feet just like he did Peter's and just like he did Judas's. And then secondly, as you sit at that table, who is Peter to you? Who's that person that just says these bold things and it just really annoys you? Or the person who gets the credit, maybe as the leader, and you're frustrated because you wanted to be the leader. Who's John to you? The one who is always next to Jesus, and when he writes his book, refers to himself as the one that Jesus loved and makes sure everyone knows that he beat Peter in the race. Who's John to you? And who's Judas to you? Who's the person that's hurt you? Who's the person that's betrayed your trust? Who's the person that's talked behind your back? Who is Judas to you? And what does it look like for you to embody the way of Jesus and live out his example and to care for them, to serve them, to wash their feet? What does that look like today? What does it look like this week?